The rain pelted against the windows of the Anderson family home as Gary pulled up in his beat-up sedan. He clutched a worn leather album to his chest, shielding it from the downpour as he made his way to the front door. Inside, Sophie's mother, Lisa, peered through the curtains, her brow furrowed with concern. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. He's here again, Lisa muttered to her husband, Tom. I don't understand why he's suddenly so interested in spending time with Sophie. Tom shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. Maybe he's just feeling nostalgic. Family's important, you know. The doorbell rang, and Sophie bounded down the stairs, her face lit up with excitement. Uncle Gary's here, she exclaimed, reaching for the door handle. Lisa intercepted her, opening the door herself. Gary, she said, her tone measured. Come in out of the rain. Gary stepped inside, shaking off his coat. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled at Sophie. Hey there, kiddo. Ready for another story night? Sophie nodded enthusiastically, but Lisa's voice cut through the moment. Gary, can I talk to you for a minute? In private? As Gary followed Lisa into the kitchen, Sophie's shoulders slumped. She could hear the hushed, tense voices of her mother and uncle, though she couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, they emerged, Lisa's face tight with barely concealed frustration, and Gary looking slightly deflated. All right, Sophie, Gary said, his cheerful tone sounding a bit forced. Let's take a look at this old album, shall we? They settled in the living room, Sophie cross-legged on the floor, Gary in an armchair. He opened the album, and the musty scent of old photographs filled the air. Sophie leaned in, her eyes wide as she took in the sepia-toned images of people she'd never seen before. Who's that? She asked, pointing to a stern-faced woman in a high-collared dress. Gary's face softened. That, my dear, is your great-grandmother, Lucia. She came to this country from Italy with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dream of a better life. As Gary began to narrate Lucia's journey, Sophie found herself transported to a different time. She could almost feel the sway of the ship that carried Lucia across the Atlantic, hear the bustle of Ellis Island, and sense the fear and excitement of starting a new life in a strange land. It wasn't easy for Lucia, Gary continued, his voice taking on a reverent tone. She faced discrimination, worked long hours in a textile factory, and struggled to learn English. But she never gave up. She saved every penny she could, eventually opening a small grocery store in our hometown. Sophie's fingers traced the outline of Lucia's face in the photograph. She looked so serious, she observed. Gary chuckled. Life had made her tough, but she had a heart of gold. She used to sneak extra food to families who were struggling during the Depression, said no one should go hungry if she could help it. As Gary continued to flip through the pages, sharing anecdotes and memories, Sophie's curiosity grew. She peppered him with questions about each photograph, each unfamiliar face. In the background, Lisa hovered, pretending to dust or rearrange knickknacks, but always within earshot. The evening wore on, and Sophie found herself yawning despite her best efforts to stay alert. Gary noticed and closed the album gently. I think that's enough for tonight, kiddo. We can pick up where we left off another time. Sophie's eyes widened. You'll come back? Tomorrow? Gary glanced at Lisa, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Sure thing, Sophie. If it's all right with your parents, I'll be back tomorrow night. As Gary prepared to leave, Sophie hugged the album to her chest. Can I keep this until tomorrow? I want to look at it some more. Gary hesitated, then nodded. Just be careful with it, okay? It's very old and fragile. After Gary left, Sophie retreated to her room, poring over the album by flashlight, long after she was supposed to be asleep. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to these stories than Uncle Gary was letting on. Why had he suddenly decided to share all this family history? And why did her mother seem so uneasy about it? As she drifted off to sleep, Sophie's dreams were filled with the faces from the album, whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. She was determined to uncover the truth behind Uncle Gary's visits and the stories he was sharing. Little did she know her curiosity was about to set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the very fabric of her family's history. The following evening, Gary arrived punctually, this time with a fishing rod in hand. Sophie's eyes lit up at the sight of it, her imagination already running wild with possibilities. "What's that for, Uncle Gary?" she asked eagerly as he settled into his now familiar spot in the living room. Gary's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Well, I thought we might go on a little adventure tonight, through stories, of course. This old rod has seen many a summer at our family's lake house." Sophie leaned in, captivated. "We have a lake house?" "Had," Gary corrected gently. "It was a beautiful place, nestled in the pines, right on the shore of Lake Willow. Your grandfather and I spent every summer there when we were about your age." As Gary began to recount tales of lazy summer days and exciting fishing expeditions, Sophie closed her eyes, allowing his words to paint vivid pictures in her mind. She could almost feel the warm sun on her face, hear the lapping of waves against the shore, and smell the crisp scent of pine needles. "One summer," Gary continued, his voice taking on a nostalgic tone, "your grandfather and I decided we were going to catch the biggest fish in the lake. We called him Old Whiskers, a catfish so large, locals swore he'd been around since the Civil War." Sophie giggled at the thought. "Did you catch him?" Gary's eyes twinkled. "Well, that's quite a story. We set out at dawn, packed lunch for the whole day. Hours went by and not a single bite. But just as we were about to pack it in, something tugged on my line so hard it nearly pulled me right out of the boat." As Gary described the epic battle that ensued, man versus fish, lasting hours as the sun set over the lake, Sophie found herself holding her breath, completely engrossed in the tale. "In the end," Gary said, leaning in conspiratorially, "Old Whiskers got away, but not before we got a good look at him. Biggest catfish I've ever seen, with whiskers as long as your arm." Sophie's eyes were wide with wonder. "Wow, do you think Old Whiskers is still there?" Gary's smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid not, kiddo. You see, the lake house, well, it's being sold." The sudden shift in tone caught Sophie off guard. "Sold? But why? Can't we keep it?" Gary sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's complicated, Sophie. Sometimes, as families grow and change, we have to let go of certain things. But that doesn't mean we lose the memories." Sophie's brow furrowed as she processed this information. "But if we sell it, how will I ever get to see it? How will I make my own memories there?" Gary placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "The memories, the stories, they're part of you now, Sophie. They're in your blood, part of what makes you an Anderson. And there are so many more stories to share, so many more pieces of our family history for you to discover." Sensing the heaviness that had settled over the room, Gary decided to shift gears. "Tell me, Sophie, what do you think it means to be part of the Anderson family?" Sophie pondered for a moment, her young mind grappling with the weight of the question. I'm not sure. We're all related, I guess? And we have the same last name?" Gary nodded encouragingly. "Those are true, yes. But being part of a family is more than just blood and names. It's about shared experiences, traditions, the stories we pass down from generation to generation. It's about understanding where we come from to better understand who we are." Sophie's eyes lit up with curiosity. "So, by learning about our family's past, I'm learning about myself?" "Exactly," Gary said, a proud smile spreading across his face. "And the best part is, you get to be part of shaping our family's future. The stories we're creating now will be the ones future generations of Andersons will learn from." As their conversation deepened, Sophie found herself asking more profound questions about her heritage, her place in the family, and the meaning of tradition. Gary, for his part, encouraged her curiosity, gently guiding her to explore her own thoughts and feelings on these complex topics. In the background, Sophie's parents exchanged glances. There was a mix of concern and something else, perhaps a grudging appreciation for the way Gary was connecting with their daughter, helping her understand her roots in a way they hadn't considered before. As the evening drew to a close, Sophie's mind was buzzing with new ideas and questions. She felt a growing sense of connection to her family's past and an excitement about uncovering more of its secrets. Little did she know, the journey of discovery she was embarking on would lead her to uncover truths that would shake the very foundation of everything she thought she knew about the Andersons. The soft glow of the living room lamp cast long shadows as Sophie and Gary settled into their now familiar positions for their third evening of storytelling. This time, however, Sophie had a glint of determination in her eye. "Uncle Gary," she began, her voice filled with excitement, "I have an idea. What if we made a book of all these family stories?" Gary's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "A book, you say? Now that's an interesting thought. What kind of book did you have in mind?" Sophie's words tumbled out in a rush. "We could write down all the stories you've been telling me, and maybe get everyone else in the family to contribute too. Like, Mom could write about her childhood, and Grandma could share her memories. We could add photos and maybe even draw pictures to go with the stories." Gary leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You know what, kiddo? I think that's a brilliant idea. It would be like creating our very own family heirloom." "Really?" Sophie beamed. "You think everyone would want to participate?" Gary nodded enthusiastically. "I don't see why not. It could be a wonderful way to bring the whole family together, to share our histories, and create something lasting for future generations of Andersons." As they began to brainstorm ideas for their family book, neither of them noticed the figure lingering in the doorway. Sophie's grandmother, Eleanor, had been quietly listening, drawn by the animated voices. Now, she stepped into the room, her eyes misty with unshed tears. "I couldn't help but overhear," Eleanor said softly, "and I think it's a wonderful idea." Sophie jumped up, rushing to hug her grandmother. "Grandma, will you share your stories too?" Eleanor nodded, lowering herself into a nearby armchair. "Of course, dear. In fact, if you don't mind, I have a story I'd like to share right now." Gary and Sophie exchanged excited glances as Eleanor began to speak, her voice taking on a faraway quality as she delved into her memories. "It was the summer of 1955, Eleanor began. "I was just a young girl, not much older than you, Sophie. That was the summer I met your grandfather, Thomas." As Eleanor recounted the tale of her first meeting with Thomas at a county fair, of stolen glances and shared cotton candy, Sophie found herself transported. She could almost smell the sweet scent of caramel apples and hear the distant tinkling of carousel music. "We danced under the stars that night," Eleanor continued, her eyes shining with the memory. "And I knew, right then and there, that he was the one I wanted to spend my life with." By the time Eleanor finished her story, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Gary, who had heard the tale before, found himself wiping away a tear. "That's beautiful, Grandma," Sophie whispered, squeezing Eleanor's hand. "It's perfect for our book." From that moment on, a new tradition was born in the Anderson household. Family members began to gather regularly, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes tears as they recounted tales from their shared history. Gary, once viewed with suspicion, became the linchpin of these gatherings, gently encouraging even the most reluctant family members to share their memories. As the weeks passed, Sophie's initial idea blossomed into something far greater than she had imagined. What started as a simple book project became a catalyst for healing old wounds and bridging generational gaps. Cousins who had grown distant reconnected over shared childhood memories. Aunts and uncles found common ground in stories of their parents and grandparents. Sophie threw herself into the project with gusto, carefully transcribing each story, organizing photos, and even creating illustrations to accompany some of the tales. Her parents, initially skeptical of Gary's sudden involvement in their lives, began to see the positive impact these gatherings were having on their daughter and the family as a whole. One evening, as the family sat around the dining room table, surrounded by photos and handwritten notes, Sophie's father cleared his throat. "I just want to say," he began, his voice uncharacteristically emotional, "that this project, well, it's brought us all closer together in a way I never expected. And Gary," he turned to his brother-in-law, "I owe you an apology. I misjudged your intentions. Thank you for bringing these stories to life for Sophie, for all of us." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting into a chorus of agreement. Gary, visibly moved, simply nodded, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. As the evening wound down, Sophie sat back, surveying the scene before her. Her family, once fractured by unspoken tensions and hidden secrets, was coming together, united by the power of their shared history. She felt a sense of pride and belonging that she had never experienced before. Little did Sophie know, however, that the stories they had uncovered so far were just the tip of the iceberg. As she continued to dig deeper into her family's past, she would soon stumble upon a secret that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the Andersons and test the newfound bonds of their family in ways she could never have imagined. As the family gatherings continued, the living room became a treasure trove of memories, with old photographs, letters, and mementos scattered across every surface. Sophie spent hours poring over these fragments of her family's past, piecing together the intricate tapestry of the Anderson history. One lazy Sunday afternoon, as Sophie was sorting through a box of old photographs, she came across an image that made her pause. It was a faded sepia print, showing a young man in a military uniform. His face bore a striking resemblance to her father, but she couldn't place him among the relatives she knew. Curiosity piqued, Sophie approached Gary, who was chatting with her parents across the room. "Uncle Gary," she called, holding up the photograph. "Who's this? He looks like Dad, but I've never seen him before." The room fell silent as Gary's eyes locked onto the photograph. A flicker of something. Was it pain? Anger? Crossed his face before he schooled his features into a neutral expression. "Where did you find that, Sophie?" Gary asked, his voice carefully controlled. "It was in one of the old boxes," Sophie replied, confused by the sudden tension in the room. "Is everything okay?" Gary hesitated, glancing at Sophie's parents before responding. That's your great-uncle Robert, your grandfather's brother." Sophie's eyes widened with excitement. "I didn't know Grandpa had a brother. Why haven't I heard about him before? What was he like?" The adults in the room exchanged uneasy glances. It was Sophie's mother who finally broke the silence. "Honey, Uncle Robert is, well, he's a complicated part of our family history." Gary sighed deeply, seeming to come to a decision. "Sophie, remember how we talked about how families are complex? Well, Robert's story is one of those complicated parts of our history. He made some choices that the family found hard to accept." Sophie's brow furrowed. "What kind of choices?" Gary ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "Robert was what you might call a black sheep. During the war, he deserted, left his unit and fled to Canada." A gasp escaped Sophie's lips. "He just left? But why?" "It's not that simple, kiddo," Gary said gently. "War is a terrible thing, and people react to it in different ways. Robert couldn't handle the violence, the killing. He made a choice that he felt was right for him, but it had serious consequences for our family. Sophie's mind whirled with this new information. What happened to him? Did he ever come back? Gary shook his head. No, he never returned. The family, well, they considered him a traitor. His name became taboo, his existence erased from our family narrative. Until now, that is. The revelation hung heavy in the air. Sophie looked around at the adults, noting the discomfort on their faces. She realized that this was more than just a story. It was a wound that had never fully healed. But, Sophie began hesitantly, doesn't everyone deserve a second chance? Maybe he was scared, or maybe he thought he was doing the right thing. Gary's expression softened. That's a very mature way of looking at it, Sophie. The truth is, life isn't always black and white. Robert's choices had far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for everyone who loved him. As the conversation continued, Sophie found herself grappling with complex emotions. She felt a mix of curiosity about this unknown relative, sympathy for his struggles, and confusion about the family's reaction. It was the first time she truly understood that her family's history wasn't all happy memories and funny anecdotes. There were dark chapters too, filled with pain and regret. The mood in the room remained tense for the rest of the afternoon. Sophie noticed her parents speaking in hushed tones, casting worried glances her way. She overheard fragments of their conversation, concerns about whether she was old enough to handle such difficult truths, debates about how much of the family's dirty laundry should be included in their book project. As the day drew to a close, Sophie sat alone in her room, the photograph of Uncle Robert propped up on her desk. She stared at his face, trying to reconcile the smiling young man in the picture with the complex, controversial figure she'd learned about. For the first time since starting this journey into her family's past, Sophie felt a twinge of uncertainty. What other secrets might be lurking in the shadows of the Anderson family tree? And was she ready to face them? Little did she know, the story of Uncle Robert was just the beginning. The revelations to come would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about her family, testing bonds and challenging long-held beliefs in ways she could never have imagined. The revelation about Uncle Robert cast a long shadow over the Anderson household in the days that followed. Sophie found herself lost in thought, mulling over the complexities of her family's history. The once exciting project of creating a family storybook now seemed fraught with potential pitfalls. One rainy afternoon, as Sophie was helping her grandmother Eleanor sort through some old belongings in the attic, she came across a small, leather-bound book tucked away in a dusty corner. Curiosity piqued. She carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with elegant, faded handwriting. "Grandma?" Sophie called out. "What's this?" Eleanor peered over her granddaughter's shoulder, her eyes widening in recognition. "Oh my," she breathed. "That's your great-grandmother's diary. I haven't seen this in years." Sophie's heart raced with excitement. "Can I read it?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I suppose it's only right. It is part of your heritage, after all." As Sophie began to leaf through the pages, her eyes caught on a particular entry. The words, "family secret," jumped out at her, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. She read on, her curiosity growing with each word. May 15th, 1932. "I fear the weight of this secret will be my undoing. How long can we keep this hidden? The truth must come out someday, but at what cost to our family?" Sophie looked up at her grandmother, her eyes wide. "Grandma, what secret is she talking about?" Eleanor's face paled slightly. I'm not sure, dear. Your great-grandmother was a very private person. She kept many things to herself." But Sophie could sense the hesitation in her grandmother's voice. There was more to this story, she was sure of it. Determined to uncover the truth, she decided to bring the diary to her next storytelling session with Uncle Gary. That evening, as Gary settled into his usual chair, Sophie produced the diary with a flourish. "Look what I found, Uncle Gary," she exclaimed, watching his reaction carefully. Gary's eyes widened in recognition, a flicker of something. Was it fear? Crossing his face before he composed himself. "Where did you find that, Sophie?" "In the attic," she replied, her voice filled with excitement. "It's great-grandma's diary. And look, she mentions a family secret. Do you know what it could be?" Gary's face grew serious. "Sophie," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "some things in our family's past are complicated. Not everything is meant to be known or shared." Sophie felt a flare of frustration. "But isn't that the whole point of our project? To uncover our family's history?" Gary sighed deeply. "There's a difference between history and secrets, kiddo. Some things are kept hidden for a reason, to protect people, to avoid reopening old wounds." But Sophie wasn't ready to give up. "Please, Uncle Gary, if there's something important in our family's past, don't I have a right to know?" For a long moment, Gary said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. "Sophie, there are things in our family's past that are difficult to talk about. Things that could change how you see some people you love. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Sophie hesitated, torn between her burning curiosity and the weight of Gary's words. She thought about Uncle Robert, about the pain and complexity his story had brought to light. Was she ready for more revelations like that? In the end, her desire to know won out. "I want to understand, Uncle Gary, even if it's hard. Our family's past is part of who I am, isn't it?" Gary nodded slowly. "It is. But remember, Sophie, once you know something, you can't unknow it. And knowledge, well, it comes with responsibility." As they sat there, the diary between them like a ticking time bomb, Sophie felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She was on the verge of uncovering a long-buried family secret, one that could potentially change everything. Little did she know, the revelations to come would test not only her understanding of her family, but also her own values and beliefs. The journey she had embarked upon was about to take a turn into uncharted territory, where the lines between right and wrong, loyalty and truth, would blur in ways she never could have imagined. The Anderson family gathered for their weekly dinner, an event that had taken on new significance since the start of Sophie's family history project. The dining room buzzed with conversation, but there was an undercurrent of tension that Sophie couldn't quite place. She noticed the adults exchanging meaningful glances, their voices dropping to whispers when they thought she wasn't paying attention. As dessert was being served, Sophie's great-grandmother's diary lay heavy in her thoughts. Unable to contain her curiosity any longer, she blurted out, "I found great-grandma's diary in the attic. It mentions a family secret. Does anyone know what it could be?" The room fell silent. Forks clattered against plates, and all eyes turned to Sophie. Her mother's face paled, while her father's jaw tightened visibly. It was her grandmother, Eleanor, who finally broke the silence. "Sophie, dear," Eleanor began, her voice gentle but firm. "Some stories are better left untold. Some secrets, well, they're kept for a reason." Sophie's brow furrowed in confusion. "But why? Isn't our family history important? Shouldn't we know everything about where we come from?" Gary cleared his throat, drawing Sophie's attention. "It's not that simple, kiddo. Family histories are complex. Sometimes keeping certain things private is a way of protecting people we love." The cryptic responses only fueled Sophie's determination. After dinner, she cornered her cousin Emma, who was a few years older and might have heard whispers of family gossip. "Emma," Sophie whispered urgently, "do you know anything about a family secret? Something from a long time ago?" Emma's eyes widened, and she glanced around nervously before leaning in. "I've heard bits and pieces," she admitted, Something about Uncle Gary and Great Uncle Thomas having a huge fight years ago. They didn't speak for decades. Sophie's mind raced. Uncle Gary and Great Uncle Thomas. But they seemed so close now. What could have caused such a rift? Driven by her growing curiosity, Sophie spent the next few days discreetly questioning various family members. She pieced together fragments of information, hushed mentions of a betrayal, allusions to a mistake that cost the family dearly, and cryptic references to the incident that changed everything. The more Sophie uncovered, the more confused she became. It seemed that this secret, whatever it was, had cast a long shadow over the family for generations. But why? And how could something from so long ago still hold such power? As Sophie delved deeper into her investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was treading on dangerous ground. The adults in her family grew increasingly evasive, changing the subject whenever she broached the topic of family history. One evening, as Sophie was helping her mother with the dishes, she decided to take a direct approach. "Mom," she began cautiously, "what happened between Uncle Gary and Great Uncle Thomas?" Her mother's hand stilled in the soapy water. When she turned to face Sophie, her expression was a mix of concern and resignation. "Sophie, honey, some things in our family's past are complicated. There was a misunderstanding a long time ago that led to some bad feelings. But what kind of misunderstanding could be so bad that it split the family apart?" Sophie pressed. Her mother sighed deeply. "It's not my story to tell, sweetheart. If you really want to know, you should talk to Uncle Gary. But are you sure you want to open this can of worms? Sometimes the past is best left in the past." Sophie nodded, her determination growing. She would talk to Uncle Gary, and she would get to the bottom of this mystery. As she lay in bed that night, Sophie's mind whirled with possibilities. What could this secret be? How bad could it really be? And why did everyone seem so afraid of it coming to light? Little did Sophie know, her persistence was about to uncover a truth that would shake the very foundations of her family. The revelation to come would test bonds, challenge long-held beliefs, and force Sophie to confront difficult questions about forgiveness, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. As she drifted off to sleep, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something big. Tomorrow, she would confront Uncle Gary and demand the truth, no matter the consequences. The Anderson family's carefully guarded secret was about to be revealed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions brewing within Sophie. She had made up her mind. Today was the day she would confront Uncle Gary and uncover the truth about their family's hidden past. She found Gary in the backyard, tending to the garden, a hobby he had taken up recently. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Sophie approached him. "Uncle Gary," she began, her voice more tremulous than she'd like. "We need to talk about the family secret." Gary's shoulders tensed visibly. He slowly put down his gardening tools and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of resignation and concern. "I had a feeling this day would come," he said softly. "What do you want to know, Sophie?" Sophie took a moment to gather her thoughts. "I've been asking around, and I know there was some kind of falling out between you and Great Uncle Thomas. What happened? Why has everyone been keeping it a secret for so long?" Gary sighed deeply, gesturing for Sophie to sit beside him on the garden bench. "It's not a simple story, kiddo, and it's not one I'm proud of. Are you sure you're ready to hear it?" Sophie nodded firmly. "I need to know, Uncle Gary. It's part of who we are, isn't it?" Gary's eyes seemed to cloud over with memories. "You're right, it is. Well, I suppose it all started about 30 years ago." As Gary began to recount the tale, Sophie listened with rapt attention. The story that unfolded was one of jealousy, misunderstanding, and a series of unfortunate events that led to a rift between the two brothers. Your great-uncle Thomas and I were always competitive, Gary explained. But things came to a head when we both fell for the same woman, your Aunt Sarah. Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. She had always known Aunt Sarah as Thomas's wife, but she had never imagined Uncle Gary had feelings for her too. Gary continued, his voice heavy with regret. I did something I'm not proud of, Sophie. I told Sarah a lie about Thomas, hoping it would turn her against him. It worked for a while, but the truth came out eventually, and it nearly tore our family apart. Sophie felt a mix of shock and disappointment wash over her. You lied? But why, Uncle Gary? That doesn't sound like you at all. Gary's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I was young, foolish, and blinded by jealousy. I convinced myself that Thomas didn't deserve Sarah, that I would be better for her. But all I did was cause pain for everyone involved. As Gary delved deeper into the story, Sophie learned of the years of estrangement that followed, of family gatherings fraught with tension, of the pain that rippled through generations of Andersons. It took years for Thomas to even consider forgiving me, Gary admitted, and even longer for the rest of the family to trust me again. That's why we've kept it quiet all these years. The wounds may have healed, but the scars, they're still there. Sophie sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything she had heard. The uncle she had come to admire so much over the past weeks suddenly seemed like a different person. She felt a confusing mix of empathy for his past mistakes and disappointment in his actions. But you and great-uncle Thomas seem so close now, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. How did you move past it? Gary's expression softened. It took time, honesty, and a lot of hard work, Sophie. We had to learn to forgive, not just each other, but ourselves too. It's not easy, but it's possible. That's one of the most important lessons I've learned in life. As the weight of the revelation settled over them, Sophie found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. Part of her wished she had never uncovered this painful chapter of her family's history. Another part felt a newfound respect for the strength it must have taken to overcome such a betrayal. Sophie, Gary said gently, breaking into her thoughts. I know this is a lot to take in, and I understand if you see me differently now. But I hope you can learn from my mistakes. Family is precious, and the bonds we share are stronger than any mistake, any misunderstanding. Sophie nodded slowly, her mind still reeling. I need some time to think about all this, Uncle Gary. As she walked away, leaving Gary alone in the garden, Sophie felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. The family she thought she knew so well suddenly seemed more complex, more human. She realized that the story of the Andersons wasn't just one of happy memories and shared laughter. It was also one of mistakes, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love. Little did Sophie know, this revelation was just the beginning. The full truth of her family's past was yet to be uncovered, and it would challenge everything she thought she knew about the Andersons in ways she could never have imagined. The days following Gary's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Sophie. She found herself looking at her family members with new eyes, seeing the weight of history in every interaction, every shared glance. The once simple task of compiling family stories now felt like navigating a minefield of hidden truths and long-buried secrets. As the next family gathering approached, tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Sophie had been uncharacteristically quiet, processing the information she had learned. Her parents exchanged worried glances, aware that their daughter was grappling with difficult truths about her family's past. The evening of the gathering arrived, and the Anderson home buzzed with nervous energy. Family members trickled in, their usual jovial greetings tinged with an undercurrent of apprehension. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the other shoe to drop. As they gathered around the dining table, Sophie couldn't help but notice the strain on her relatives' faces. Uncle Gary sat at one end, his usual cheerful demeanor subdued. Great Uncle Thomas, visiting for the occasion, occupied the other end, his expression unreadable. Sophie's mother attempted to break the ice. "So, how is everyone's contribution to the family history book coming along?" A tense silence followed, broken only by the clinking of cutlery against plates. Sophie felt the weight of unspoken words pressing down on her. Unable to bear it any longer, she took a deep breath and spoke. "I know about what happened between Uncle Gary and Great Uncle Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know about the secret you've all been keeping." The room fell deathly quiet. All eyes turned to Sophie, a mix of shock, fear, and resignation on the adults' faces. Gary was the first to respond, his voice heavy with emotion. "Sophie, I'm so sorry you had to find out like this. We were trying to protect you, to protect the family." Great Uncle Thomas cleared his throat. "It was a different time, a different us. We've all made mistakes, learned from them, grown." Sophie looked around the table, taking in the faces of her loved ones. "But why keep it a secret? Don't you think it's important for us to know our true history, even the difficult parts?" Her grandmother Eleanor spoke up, her voice gentle. "Sometimes, dear, the past is best left in the past. We didn't want to burden the younger generation with our old mistakes." Sophie felt a surge of frustration. "But don't you see? By keeping these secrets, you're creating new burdens. I've been so confused, trying to piece together whispers and half-truths. Wouldn't it be better to be honest?" The adults exchanged glances, a mix of guilt and uncertainty on their faces. Sophie's father spoke next, his voice thoughtful. "You might be right, Sophie. Perhaps we've been too cautious, too afraid of confronting our past." As the conversation unfolded, family members began to open up. Years of pent-up emotions, regrets, and unspoken thoughts came pouring out. There were tears, raised voices, and moments of tense silence. But there was also laughter, shared memories, and, most importantly, honesty. Sophie listened intently as her relatives shared their perspectives on the events that had divided the family so many years ago. She began to understand the complexity of human emotions, the way that love and jealousy, loyalty and betrayal could intertwine in messy, complicated ways. As the night wore on, something remarkable began to happen. The tension that had filled the room at the start of the evening began to dissipate. In its place, a new sense of understanding and closeness emerged. Family members who had been distant for years found themselves reconnecting, sharing stories and memories long forgotten. Gary and Thomas, seated at opposite ends of the table, caught each other's eye. A moment of understanding passed between them, years of resentment and regret melting away in an instant. They stood simultaneously, meeting in the middle of the room in a tight embrace that brought tears to everyone's eyes. As Sophie watched this scene unfold, she felt a profound sense of relief and joy. The truth, painful as it had been to uncover, had set her family free. The secrets that had weighed them down for so long were finally out in the open, allowing for true healing to begin. Little did Sophie know, however, that this cathartic evening was just the beginning. The most shocking revelation of all was yet to come, one that would challenge everything the Andersons thought they knew about their family and force them to redefine the very meaning of forgiveness and love. As the emotional family gathering wound down, an unexpected ring of the doorbell cut through the atmosphere. The Andersons exchanged puzzled glances. Who could be visiting at this late hour? Sophie's father rose to answer the door, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Moments later, he returned to the dining room, his face ashen. "Gary," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's for you. It's Thomas." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Great Uncle Thomas was already here, wasn't he? But as Sophie turned to look at the man she had known as her great-uncle all evening, she saw a flicker of something. Fear? Resignation? Cross his face. Gary stood slowly, his legs seeming to barely support him. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He made his way to the front door, the rest of the family following in tense silence. There, framed in the doorway, stood an elderly man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the Thomas sitting at their dinner table. The newcomer's eyes were filled with a mixture of pain, hope, and trepidation. "Hello, Gary," the man said, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's been a long time, brother." The room erupted into chaos. Confused exclamations and demands for explanations filled the air. Sophie felt as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly disappeared. If this was the real Thomas, then who was the man she had known as her great-uncle all these years? Gary raised his hands, calling for silence. "Please," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of decades of secrets. "Let me explain." Over the next hour, a story unfolded that was more shocking than anything Sophie could have imagined. The man they had known as Thomas was actually Gary's cousin, Richard. The real Thomas had left the country decades ago, following the bitter falling out with Gary. "After our fight," Gary explained, his voice thick with regret, "Thomas left. He said he never wanted to see any of us again. We told everyone he had died in an accident. Richard agreed to take his place, to spare the family the shame and pain of the truth." The real Thomas spoke up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was angry, hurt. I thought leaving would punish Gary, would make him feel the pain I felt. But as the years passed, I realized the only one I was punishing was myself. I missed my family, my home, but I was too proud, too afraid to come back." Sophie looked around at her family members, seeing the shock and disbelief mirrored on every face. The revelation seemed to hang in the air, too enormous to fully comprehend. "But why?" Sophie's mother asked, her voice trembling. "Why go to such lengths to keep this secret?" Gary and Richard exchanged a glance, laden with years of shared burden. "We thought we were protecting the family," Richard said softly. "We never imagined the deception would last this long, would grow so big." As the night wore on, more details emerged. The depth of the deception, the intricate web of lies that had been woven over decades, left everyone reeling. Family members alternated between anger at the betrayal and a grudging understanding of the complex emotions that had driven Gary and Richard to such extreme measures. Sophie, for her part, felt as if she were watching her family's history being rewritten before her eyes. The stories she had cherished, the relationships she had thought she understood, everything was cast in a new light. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the exhausted family, Sophie realized that this revelation changed everything. The family history book she had been so eager to compile now seemed like a work of fiction. But as she looked around at her family, the pain, the honesty, the tentative steps towards forgiveness she was witnessing, she understood that this, too, was part of their story. The Andersons had been irrevocably changed by this night of truth. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with the challenge of rebuilding trust and redefining relationships. But as Sophie watched Gary, Richard, and the real Thomas, three old men bound by love, mistakes, and a lifetime of shared history, tentatively embrace, she felt a glimmer of hope. This, she realized, was the true legacy of the Anderson family. Not the polished stories of success and happiness she had initially sought to capture, but the messy, complicated, deeply human struggle of people trying to love each other despite their flaws and mistakes. As the family began to disperse, emotionally drained, but somehow lighter, Sophie knew that their journey was far from over. The final chapter of the Anderson family story was yet to be written, and it would be one of healing, forgiveness, and the rediscovery of what it truly means to be family. The days following the earth-shattering revelation passed in a blur for Sophie and the rest of the Andersons. The family was left grappling with the aftermath of decades of deception, trying to reconcile their memories with this new reality. Sophie found herself at the center of it all, her family history project now taking on a significance she could never have anticipated. As the shock began to wear off, the family decided to come together once more. This time, not to uncover secrets, but to begin the arduous process of healing and rebuilding trust. The atmosphere was tense as everyone gathered in the living room, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. Sophie sat quietly, observing the faces of her family members. Gary looked older than she'd ever seen him, the burden of his long-held secret finally lifted, but leaving visible scars. Richard, the man she'd known as Great Uncle Thomas, seemed lost, his identity crisis palpable. And the real Thomas, still somewhat of a stranger, watched everyone with a mixture of longing and apprehension. As the silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable, the shrill ring of a phone cut through the tension. Gary answered it, his brow furrowing as he listened to the voice on the other end. When he hung up, his face was pale. "That was my doctor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The test results are in. I have cancer. It's advanced." The room fell into stunned silence. Sophie felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her feet. After everything they'd been through, after all the secrets and lies, this stark reality felt like a cruel twist of fate. It was Thomas who broke the silence, rising from his seat with determination. "Gary," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know we have a lot to work through, but I'll be damned if I'm going to let you face this alone. We've lost too much time already." Richard nodded in agreement. "We're family," he said simply. "All of us, no matter what." As if a dam had broken, the room erupted into action. Family members rallied around Gary, offering support, making plans, showing a united front in the face of this new challenge. Sophie watched in awe as years of resentment and hurt seemed to melt away, replaced by a fierce determination to stand together. In the midst of the commotion, Sophie found herself standing next to the real Thomas. "I don't understand," she said softly. "After everything that's happened, how can you all come together so quickly?" Thomas smiled sadly, his eyes never leaving Gary. "Family is complicated, Sophie. We hurt each other, we make mistakes, but when it really matters, when the chips are down, we show up. That's what being an Anderson means." Over the following weeks, Sophie watched as her family underwent a transformation. The process of reconciliation was not easy. There were heated arguments, tearful confessions, and moments of doubt. But there was also laughter, shared memories, and a growing sense of unity. Gary's illness became a catalyst for change. As he underwent treatment, the family rallied around him. Old grievances were set aside as they focused on supporting Gary and each other. Sophie saw a side of her family she had never known existed, resilient, compassionate, and fiercely loyal. The Family History Book Project took on a new dimension. Instead of a simple collection of happy memories, it became a testament to the Anderson family's journey, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Sophie worked tirelessly, interviewing family members, documenting their stories of struggle and redemption. As Gary's condition worsened, the family spent more time together than ever before. They shared meals, told stories, and created new memories. Sophie noticed that even in his weakened state, Gary seemed more at peace than she had ever seen him. One evening, as the family gathered around Gary's hospital bed, he gestured for Sophie to come closer. "I want you to know," he said, his voice weak but filled with emotion, "that your project, your questions, they saved us, Sophie. You brought our family back together. You helped us face our past so we could move forward." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she squeezed her uncle's hand. She looked around at her family, at Richard and Thomas, once strangers, now inseparable. At her parents, their love strengthened by the trials they had faced. At her cousins, aunts, and uncles, all united in their support for each other. In that moment, Sophie understood the true meaning of family. It wasn't about perfect stories or unblemished histories. It was about love that endured despite mistakes, forgiveness that healed old wounds, and the courage to face the future together, no matter what it might bring. As Gary closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his face, Sophie knew that the Anderson family story was far from over. There would be more challenges, more joy, more sorrow, but they would face it all together, their bonds strengthened by the truths they had uncovered and the love they had rediscovered. And Sophie, with her book of family history clutched to her chest, knew that she would be there to document it all. The continuing story of the Andersons, a family tested by time, strengthened by adversity, and ultimately united by love.